What I want to talk about today, and maybe answer and give context to the two presentations before me, is what is it that makes cannabis reform so challenging, and why is the job that I get quite difficult? Yeah, why has not much really happened when it comes to drug reform? You should think back to David's presentation at the beginning. Not a great deal has happened in drug reform over the past 20 years. What, if anything, cannabis has gone from a class C to a class B. So in fact, it's kind of gone the other way. It's not been very progressive at all. So how can we, I'm going to talk about what those challenges are. How can we work around them? What can we do about those challenges? And finally, is the UK going to follow suit? Are we going to see a regulated cannabis market in the UK? Are we going to see any changes to our laws? Cool. So Volteface is a drug advocacy organisation based in London, formed in 2016. We do reports on all sorts of different drug-related policy issues. We then use those reports to engage the media and politicians. So we do research and work, and then we use that work to engage politicians and the media. Funded by philanthropy, we're now funded by the industry, like most groups in this space, and we take donations from people. Just a quick run through some of the reports we've done. We did a Tide Effect, which was just about cannabis reform in the world, what's going on globally. High Stakes, which was about spice use in prisons. Black Sheep, which looked at cannabis use and treatment, what was going on in drug treatment. Green Screen, which was about how you could sell weed online and different markets you could create for it. Greg's favourite report was Street Lottery, which he reads before bed, about cannabis for mental health. Backyard was a report that Lizzie wrote around drug consumption rooms. Children's Inquiry was something we did quite recently, which looked at how the illicit cannabis market impacts children. Making a Grade was a report about education, and then we obviously ran the Charlotte Caldwell's campaign that led to the not-so-successful medicinal cannabis laws, which I'm sure will come up on the discussion. We also did this recently, which this might play. I'm never quite trusting of technology. There we go. I don't think there's any volume, but anything that involves David Lammy surrounded by weed is always good value for money. So we took a lot of politicians to Canada with a BBC film crew, and I don't know if you saw it in the media recently. The BBC ran it as a main story for a couple of days, and it led to David Lammy, Norman Lamb, and Jonathan Gianogli saying that cannabis will be legal within 5 to 10 years. That was their best guess. Cool. Outside of my Volteface work, I also volunteer at the Loop. Is any loopers in the building? Yeah, go Loop. Loop. Loop's amazing. Look, we go to festivals and test people's drugs, which is both fun and exceptionally important, right? Especially when drug-related deaths are at such a high. And I also work for Drugs and Me. Anybody visited Drugs and Me, the website? Yeah, okay, a couple of people. Yeah, nice, cool. It's a great website, check it out. www.drugsand.me. Say again? Don't check it now. All right, cool. So first challenge, the first main challenge when working in drug reform, and it's a bit of a difficult pill to swallow, but it's that evidence doesn't always work, okay? So I spent years, I used to work in drug treatment, worked in drug treatment for 9 years, and for about 6 years, 7 years of that, I went to schools, universities, and I tried to change people's minds about drug policy, drug use, right? And I love Professor Nutt. I think he's absolutely great. It's a real privilege to speak on the same panel as him and the same event. And I showed him this. You'll all be familiar with that on the left. I'm guessing that was David Nutt's seminal work on drug-related harms. And I've used that work for years and years to show people that our drug laws are completely upside down and that alcohol is a far more problematic and dangerous drug. Yeah, it's a legal one, right? Evidence, solid evidence about how our drug laws are wrong. Yeah, that doesn't always change people's minds. And years and years and years of presenting this, doing it time after time after time, the truth of it is it doesn't work for everyone. Some people would look at it and they would go, oh yeah, do you know what, you're right, you've really opened my eyes to that. I think totally differently about drug laws now. Yeah, alcohol is really dangerous. And do you know what, I'd be up for changing and reforming our drug laws. But not the whole room would do that. I used to do a lot of work training social workers, so you kind of get like a 50-50 split of liberals and conservatives, and maybe half the room would be like, yeah, I feel like my views have changed. But for some people, it just wouldn't work. They would see that evidence, they would look at it, and they'd go, that's really interesting, but I'm not convinced. I've not changed my mind, okay? So you have to think, why is that? Why can we not just present obvious evidence? And this room, I'm guessing, will be ideologically quite far left, or not far, well, maybe far left, left-ish. Or maybe a couple of centre ground. So for us, we're probably kind of like, well, yeah, it makes sense. We should reform our drug laws. But for lots of people, they look at it and they genuinely don't want anything to do with it. So I went from drug treatment, working in drug treatment for 9 years, to policy, and I kind of brought that mentality with me. I thought, well, we'll just show people the evidence. This will be a really easy job, right? I'll just go meet politicians, and I'll just say to the politicians, have you not seen David Nutt's work? Or have you not seen this? You've not seen that? Have you changed your mind now? And it didn't work. Politicians would be like, no, I've not changed my mind. I'm not bothered. You send me all you want. Send me as much David Nutt stuff as you want. I'm not changing my mind. which suddenly makes the job really difficult because you start to realise evidence doesn't work. And when I started the job, I'm pressing it on this now, the first book I really read on the subject was handed down to me from someone else, a guy called George McBride, who'd worked in policy a couple of years longer than me. And I was like, George, why is evidence not work? Why is this so difficult? And he said, you should read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. It'll change the way you think about drug policy, and it did. It was an incredible book. And this book outlined why it's so hard. Ultimately, the key principle in the book comes from the first rule of moral psychology, and that is that intuitions come first and strategic reasoning comes second. So we tend to have like a gut reaction. When we're presented with information, we tend to have like a gut reaction that just feels right, but it's not until after that we start to use evidence to kind of assess it, right? We have a gut reaction, and then after that we have strategic reasoning. And this makes it really, 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 really difficult when doing drug policy, because think about the way in which the public interact with drug policy, yeah? Consider how evidence is presented to the public. In a world where we get constant information and we're very busy, we haven't got time to sit down and read the books that you guys will have read, watch the talks that you guys will have read, have the experiences that you guys have read, sit there and look at David Nutt's work in detail. They haven't got the time for it. If they don't care about drugs, this is a group that cares about drugs, otherwise I wouldn't be here. If they don't care, they're as interested as you guys are about building train sets. I mean, sorry if anybody's into building train sets, but if someone just said to you, train sets are amazing for kids, they really calm their mental health, do you think we should give all kids train sets? A lot of people are like, oh, I'm not really bothered, I don't really care. You start reading about train sets. And the same thing happens with drug reform for people. They have strong gut reactions and not really interested in going deep, deep, deep into the evidence, right? It makes the job really, 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 really difficult. The major issue with drug policy is that it's a moral issue. So unlike train sets, I could probably convince you guys to be all right with giving kids more access to train sets, because it's not a moral issue. It doesn't invoke a gut, strong reaction, yeah? But drug use does, whether you like it or not. Drug use invokes strong moral reactions in people because of the history of drug laws and the way in which the public have been given information on drugs, right? It invokes this strong gut reaction rather than evidence-based thinking. A lot of this is put the drugs a bad thing, because you think about like most of our experience of drugs education in school, and you think about society now as a whole, what do most people think about drugs? Well, most people have been told they're really dangerous and they're bad. So they go off that gut instinct rather than searching out evidence. And that's what we've been told in schools, right? Which is why I'll come on to it in a bit. That's why drug education is so important. And unlike other areas of policy, drug reform, people aren't passive about it. The thing I always find interesting about my job is anyone I tell that I lobby government and engage government around drug reform, they'll always give me an opinion. They're always in there and they've got an opinion. Regardless of their experience of drugs, they've always got an opinion on it. Right? Because who can resist the urge to tell someone what they think about drugs? It's such a juicy subject for a lot of people, they can't help it. Yeah? And that makes the job really, really, really difficult. Something that Jonathan Haidt talked about in his book is this concept of moral dumbfounding. Right? And this is where people have that strong gut reaction. And in The Righteous Mind, he kind of talks about what that looks like. It's that strong gut reaction without really knowing what it is. And that idea in the previous slide where I talked about intuition comes first and then strategic reasoning comes second. You kind of like start with an initial gut feeling, and then after that gut feeling you go off and make the evidence. I see this happening all the time when it comes to drug reform. This is really, really, really common. Classrooms and universities up and down the country where I've talked about this issue, and I've done an exercise with people, a drugs box exercise, which always breaks people's minds and highlights all the work that Professor Nutt has done and shows that alcohol is more dangerous than all these other drugs. Afterwards, we obviously have a conversation. And in that conversation, a lot of people will sit in a room and they'll say, no, it's still not right. There's no way alcohol is more dangerous than MDMA. There's no way. And then what they'll do, once they've had that gut reaction, is they'll then start to find things which just back up their initial feeling. And we see that with proponents to drug reform. Peter Hitchens is a classic. So what Peter Hitchens will do is, morally, he absolutely hates people using drugs. He doesn't like alcohol, he doesn't like any drugs, okay? He's a staunch social conservative. So he has that visceral gut reaction to drug reform, and then what he does is he goes and finds evidence that backs up his gut feeling. So he'll go, we should really look to South Korea and Japan. They've got it right. It's not based on evidence. That's like anybody who's looked into that knows that South Korea and Japan are not comparable to the UK, and it's a bit of a false argument. Yet it satisfies that gut reaction, so he goes and does it. If you look at other proponents to work that we've done, like Centre for Social Justice, they do the same thing. So they go, oh, it's morally wrong, don't like change. and then they'll go and find shady evidence or just have they'll say, if you legalise weed, then everything would go crazy. Loads of young people would start using it, which again goes against the evidence, but it satisfies that gut reaction. The basic idea is we rationalise our gut instincts rather than using to reach the best conclusion. And this makes it really, really difficult. The other thing that's interesting around this is I do this talk a lot in universities, and liberals tend to think we're kind of immune to moral dumbfounding. And it's not true. Like, people on the left can be fall just as foul of this as people on the right. It just so happens that we're going to be focusing on social conservatives, but this is the bit that might be fun if you're taking acid. Go in and see the dog a bit. But this is an example of how moral dumbfounding can happen with everybody. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but typically speaking, most people will find that quite repulsive. Just to read it out: family's dog is killed by a car in front of their house. They heard dog meat was delicious, so they cut the dog's body and cooked it and ate after dinner. Most of us will be like, that's wrong, like, that's weird, you shouldn't. We haven't got time to start doing show of hands, but most people will be like, no, that's wrong. But really, when you explore it, you've just been morally dumbfounded. You've got a gut reaction that's wrong, and evidence-wise, you can't really produce anything. The dog's dead, and they're just eating it because it tastes nice. Like, nothing really is going on. Any Game of Thrones fans will be familiar with this storyline. Although the example's slightly different. They're not going all the way. They're just kissing in a cupboard. But again, like, we'll have a gut reaction which suggests that's probably wrong. Like, brother and sister shouldn't be kissing in secret in a cupboard. But it's likely that you've been morally dumbfounded because there's no evidence to suggest that that's wrong. We might look at it and frown upon it and say it's bad. But you're just having the same reaction that social conservatives have when it comes to drugs. They'll go, it's wrong. People shouldn't really be having experiences outside the head and outside the body. It doesn't really fit with my beliefs and my core principles, therefore I think it's wrong. And then when I've done this exercise, we obviously haven't got the time, but I've done this exercise, I've said to people what's wrong about it. People start to like attach other things. Like they go, oh, it's incest, they're going to have kids. Well, I'm not saying in the example they've had kids. Same with the dog. Oh, it's wrong for the dog. It's not fair on the dog's dead. So people find evidence and just make things up. I did this one and someone said, it's illegal. It's like, it's not illegal for a brother and a sister kissing a couple. It's not that I'm not encouraging it. I'm not encouraging any of these things. I'm as dumbfounded as you are. But it's true, there's no evidence to suggest anything wrong with it. So the reaction we have to these is exactly what happens with social conservatives and people that are opposed to drug reform, okay? And that's a problem. And it makes you unpopular, right? Doing my job and talking about how drug reform needs to appease more than just one ideology makes you a target. Greg alluded to it. Greg's called me out before we've even had a panel discussion. If you say anything outside of a classic, what people are used to when it comes to drug reform, you're putting your head above the parapet. It's difficult, but you want to change policy, you have to think about some of these things. I'll just fly through this quickly, but this is basically a definition that Haidt talks about in the book. It's a model of social intuitionism. It's primarily intuitive, it's rationalised, it's justified after the fact, like we were just giving examples of the people kissing in the cupboard. It's mainly taken to influence other people. But there is hope. You can change people's opinion who are morally dumbfounded. It's not like once you're morally dumbfounded on issue, that's it, you're a lost cause, you will never change your mind. It's not that we will never convince a social conservative to be up for drug reform. Of course you can. It just takes time and you've got to discuss it with them. It's much more of a process than just saying, there's evidence, have you changed your mind yet? Which to date is kind of what drug reform's done. To give you a really quick visualisation of what that looks like, and the way I think about moral dumbfoundment in my head, and when we're trying to think of policy, or we're thinking about how do we engage people and politicians, mainly politicians and the media, on this subject, we think about this model. So the rider and the elephant, who's really in control? Well, if the elephant wants to go in a certain direction, it's going that direction. It doesn't matter how hard the rider hits it or twists their legs, the elephant is going to go in that direction. That's the gut instinct, yeah? If you've ever been in an argument and you just really dig in, and I'm right, it's probably the elephant that's leading the argument. And then a few days later, you might be like, oh, actually, I'll think about it. Maybe I was wrong. That's the rider kicking in. The rider is the conscious, verbal thinking brain, and the elephant is just that visceral, emotional, automatic response, right? So why is this relevant? Why am I talking to you guys about moral principles when I'm meant to be talking about cannabis? Well, the reason it's relevant is if you look at the things that people care about, these are the main moral principles, right? These are 6 pillars that everybody in society will rank in a particular order. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second, right? So these pillars essentially guide our decision making, and every one of us in the room will rank them on different orders. And if we did certain psychometric testing, we would come out the back of that with like, this is what you care about. If you've ever done the political ideology thing, similar thing, it puts you in a certain place. These sort of isometrics would do the same thing. You'd care about one of these, and that would be a reflection of your political ideology. Okay, I'm going to show you what you are likely or less likely to care about in a second. The sad truth of it is that most of you will probably live in an ideological bubble, and in many ways drug reform has been an ideological bubble for years. That's why I get flack for talking about the issue a little bit outside of far left perspective. The left have owned this debate for years and years and years and years and years, and all the arguments that have been constructed around drug reform have been left-wing arguments. And even though I'm left of centre, we still need to construct arguments that appease more than just people that have been talking about it for years, right? Especially if you want change to occur, and if you don't want to just banging heads against the wall forever and ever and ever. So most of us just surround ourselves with people that agree with us. Twitter is a really good example of that. Facebook's a really good example. So when you're debating and talking about these issues, you forget that outside of your own view, there are millions of other people, 65 million people in the UK, and most of them probably have a very different ideological perspectives to yourselves. So what does that look like then? It looks a bit like this. So most people that are liberals, I'd imagine this is probably a liberal heavy room, their main principles that they care about, obviously the thicker the line, the more they care about the issue. So typically speaking, liberals are really bothered about care and harm. That's like the number one. They don't want to see people hurt. They don't want to see people harmed. Yeah? That's a main principle of most people that would identify as a liberal, left-leaning. They're bothered about liberty and oppression, less so, but it's still a key principle. So they don't want to see people oppressed. They don't want to see people's liberty hindered upon, right? They don't want to see a lack of liberty. They're bothered about fairness and cheating, but to a lesser degree of the others. But outside of that, you tend to find that the others they're not that bothered about. Are they that bothered about loyalty? Well, it's not saying that people are left-wing are not loyal. Of course they are. But it's just less of a priority for them. They're not particularly bothered about authority and large authority groups, which is why most left-wing people are fine with larger states rather than smaller states, right? Because they're kind of not that bothered about someone having a lot of authority over them. They'll be like, yeah, let the state go big, I'm not bothered. Sanctity degradation, again, is not a major thing. But if you look at social conservatives, who are the group that we have to work with, right? If you want to create drug reform in the UK, you have to accept that the UK has a large base of social conservatives. We can't just ignore them in the discussion and keep telling them they're wrong. We have to listen to them if we're going to try and change their opinion. Okay? So social conservatives, their most sacred value is to preserve the institutions and traditions that sustain a moral community. Yeah? That immediately presents us with an issue. But it's wrong to think that they're not bothered about things. They are bothered about things. They're just thinking about more than a classic liberal. They're weighing things up. So when you start talking to them about issues of drug reform, they'll start to worry about community. Look at Hitchens, look at the Centre for Social Justice's work. What's their main worry? Their worry is that the world will go to hell if we legalise drugs. And they invoke fear in people, right? Those arguments are wrong. Evidently they're wrong. We can show them that they're wrong with evidence. But their mind switched off to it because they're too worried that it's going to wreck society. And they're weighing up all these things. Well, left-wing people are like, well, do you know what? If things go a bit wild for a while, I'm not that bothered as long as people aren't getting harmed. Comes back to that main principle of like, well, I care more about harm than I do about like order. So that's kind of fine with me. Whereas social conservatives are going, oh, it's all a bit too risky, it's freaking me out. Libertarians are interesting when you talk about drug reform. There'd be loads of libertarians that could come in this room and you'd all nod their head. They'd do a talk, you'd be going, that's amazing. You'd agree with them on drug reform because all they're bothered about is liberty and oppression. Don't oppress, let me do what I want. I'm an adult, I should be able to do and take whatever I want, so let me go and do it. Again, liberals are like, yeah, that's fine, yeah, let people do whatever they want to do. But when it comes to like size of the state or like housing policy or immigration, then you might start to find issues with that group. Typically, they just want a really small state and they want to kind of do whatever. But libertarians are really on board with this. A good example is the ASI, Adam Smith Institute, are really good on drug reform. They're very much like legalise drugs, even though they're a right-wing neoliberal think tank, as are the Institute of Economic Affairs, a group that's constantly slagged off by the left in The Guardian, yet if you were to read their drug report stuff, you'd be like, that's great, because they want to just legalise drugs. So what can we do about it, right? I'm presenting information to you guys to suggest that drug reform is not as easy as just showing people evidence and saying, have you changed your mind yet? I'm showing you that people care about more things, the issue is much broader, and what do we do about it? Well, the first thing we have to do is accept that to create reform quickly, you have to work with people's fear, you can't just dismiss it. Especially from a policy perspective, when people haven't got time to go through information and more information and more information and watch all Professor Nutt's talks and read all these books, they've not got the time, that's not going to work, okay? You have to accept that people are scared about drug reform and you have to listen to those fears and you have to create policy that they go, oh right, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, rather than going, that's absolutely bonkers, I never want to hear that idea again, okay? And that's why, and this might be controversial, I'm happy for people to debate me on the panel, but like that's why I think right now cannabis reform is the battle that people should be focused on, not let's legalise all drugs. Not because I don't think that's a good thing. I obviously worked in treatment for 9 years. Legalising all drugs is obviously a better idea than the system we've got now. Like I've got 9 years experience seeing why that's the case. 10 minutes, thanks, cool. But are the public ready for that now? No, loads of work to do before that's good. But the suggestion is cannabis is getting closer, okay? So we have to work with people's fears rather than just chucking them away. The other thing we have to do is take people on a journey rather than just telling them that they're wrong. I spent 9 years trying to change people's opinions in treatment. People had come in with like half their leg in like DVT spreading everywhere, and they wouldn't change their mind by you just going, that's really bad, your leg's going to fall off, you should stop doing that. That wouldn't work. Just telling them that they're wrong and the behaviour they're doing is wrong wouldn't change their mind. You have to take them on a journey, which is you have to be much more patient, and you have to adopt much more thoughtful techniques. The last thing is we probably need to create a policy which addresses more than 2 moral pillars. So again, whether you like this or not, like drug policy is probably going to have to appease more than just the care and harm bubble and the authority bubble. It's probably going to have to be appeasing to the majority of the population. Maybe not all of it, you don't have to have every single person sign up to a particular policy, but it's probably going to have to think a little bit outside of the arguments that you've typically heard when it comes to drug reform. And the last thing is essentially really, really important, is to create a narrative rather than leaning too heavily on the evidence. That's not to say that you should dismiss evidence and go against it, of course not, but narratives in the current setup we have in the UK, like the way in which we digest information, the relationship the public has with the media, I could talk about this for hours, but we can't, the relationship the politicians have with the public and the media, and that triad, how that works is through narratives, okay, not always evidence. Look at the Billy Caldwell case. It was a narrative, it was just a public narrative. It was a narrative that appeared every single day. It was like a series. It appeared every single day on TV in the morning, the afternoon and the evening, and it spanned over like 4 weeks, and it led to major policy change, the biggest change the country's seen in drug reform for years. Not saying the outcome is perfect, it's far, 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 far from perfect, but what I'm telling you is that was a narrative. It wasn't just, there's evidence, change your mind. And what does that look like in practice then? So what would it actually be? Well, the Canadian framing is likely to be received well here in the UK. Likely, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's probably the most likely outcome. And the reason being for that, if you look at what Trudeau did, the sort of a centre-left government, most of the Canadian public were absolutely fine with cannabis reform. And the reason being is they stuck to 2 key principles: protect young people and take money from criminal gangs. This wasn't a libertarian left-wing idea of like, just let people do whatever, drugs are really, like, everyone should be able to do it and like, it's really good fun. That would not have worked in Canada. But what worked is they kept taking it back to, we need to protect kids and we need to take money from criminal gangs. It went through with very, very little opposition. Now I think that, this is quite a politically conservative country, right? I mean, unfortunately, it's kind of a centre-right country. So it's unlikely we're going to see very, very liberal drug reform. It's more likely we're going to see something that's focused on those 2 issues. Does that mean it'll be the same as Canada? Maybe not. I'm just saying that that's probably the most likely outcome. It needs to be framing which appeases everybody in that moral matrix I showed you, and is not just owned by one ideological group. And that's going to be uncomfortable. That's why I get flack. That's uncomfortable for people who are left and have campaigned for drug reform for a long time, because we're kind of making arguments which sometimes go against things that they believe in, or would have to be an ideological compromise or a policy compromise. The debate, well, I guess the place we're at now is this is the time for people to start exploring and talking about those models. If you look at public support for cannabis, I'll show you the stats in a second, it's higher than it ever has been. But what we're not doing with people is saying, what model would you want? What would that actually look like? We know that the public are saying, yeah, we should reform our drug laws, but we've no idea, really, what model they would say, yeah, I'm absolutely fine with that. And I think that's the point we're at now. And it's really dangerous for us to just assume what that model looks like. The Canadian model's likely to receive the highest level of support, I think. That's my gut instinct. No, not my gut instinct, that's the right. But we can learn from the data coming out of Canada. The good thing is that data is still coming together, and we can use it to help shift and change the debate here in the UK. Is it going to happen? Is cannabis reform really going to happen in the UK? Well, the YouGov poll that happened after we did all the BBC stuff, they just did it off their own bat, which is great because it saves you vast amounts of money. They just did a poll in July 2019, and that showed a 10% increase in support for legalising cannabis in the UK. Alongside that 10% increase, there was also a reduction in those who oppose. So I think some of those narratives are cutting through. I think the normalisation of cannabis through medicinal cannabis is working. I think politicians talking openly and positively about cannabis is working. I think things like that BBC campaign, MPs say it's 5 to 10 years. Other people think that's too long. Amy, you're saying that's kind of too long, 5 to 10 years is too long. I tend to agree. But at least that information is out there for people to digest, right? That's what it's about, creating narratives and images in the media that people can go, oh, okay, cool, things are happening, rather than just going, you're all wrong. It would be much safer if we change that. Is it going to happen? The other thing I think is like, well, everything went weird when David Bowie died. I don't know if anybody else noticed this. It's true, isn't it? No, genuinely, everything went really weird when David Bowie died. So anything is possible. Like the moment when Donald Trump tweeted about his friend, Kanye West, and how the two of them were going to team up and save A$AP Rocky from a Swedish prison, anything, genuinely, like, that is, I mean, we're through the looking glass and we're on acid on the other side. That is mad stuff, right? So anything could happen. And look at the politicians we currently have in government. Boris essentially is a libertarian. He's a populist libertarian. So look how much he changes his mind. Boris will say whatever he perceives to be popular, or what he perceives will get him more support. He's not someone who sticks by an ideology fiercely. He could be a character that would do this. I could see that happening. Same with Corbyn. Corbyn might just need the Lib Dems to get over the line and be a prime minister of the country. Yeah? And we know that would probably involve a coalition with the Lib Dems, the only party we've got in government who openly support cannabis reform. If the Lib Dems got in, they'd do it, and they might do in Brexit wars. They're polling as good as they can. Cheers. So I'll just leave you with this final thought. I guess this is how I'd kind of conclude the question, how we're going to legalise cannabis. I think in a post-Brexit UK, could a cannabis policy which creates jobs, improves the economy, addresses major social justice issues, and demonstrates autonomy from the EU be a major political win? I think so. I think it could. And I think if a politician realises that and sees it, we could see cannabis legalised far sooner than ever think. Thanks for your attention and time.